7 years after 9/11, what can we say about the national security strategy devised by the Bush administration in the aftermath of that horrible day? Well, what we can say is that the verdict is in, and that strategy has failed. Failure is massive, irrevocable, and decisive, and we need a new approach. Let's try to remember what the Bush administration actually set out to do with its so-called global war on terror. Here's an extract from a memo that Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld sent to President Bush on September 30th, 2001, and I quote, "If the war," referring here to the war on terror, "if the war does not significantly change the world's political map, the U.S. will not achieve its aim." End of quote. What exactly did that mean? Rumsfeld's chief strategist, Douglas Feith, in a memo that he subsequently sent to Secretary Rumsfeld, expanded on this aim. Feith wrote that the idea was, quote, "to transform the Middle East and the broader world of Islam generally," end of quote. Well, transform the Middle East, transform the Islamic world, these were enormous objectives. And quite frankly, the only explanation for their ambition is to recognize that Rumsfeld and Feith and other senior members of the Bush administration were co-religionists in the Church of the Indispensable Nation. They were persuaded that American power had no limits. They were also persuaded that they themselves were sophisticated strategists who could be trusted to use American power wisely. Well, what we can say 7 years later is that American power was nowhere near as great as they estimated, and we certainly can say that their own wisdom and savvy was no longer nearly as great as they themselves estimated it to be. Why did we invade Iraq? Well, we invaded Iraq because Rumsfeld and Feith and others saw Iraq not as a threat, but in fact as weak and therefore a place to kickstart this strategy of transformation. Commentators said at the time that Baghdad was not intended to be the end of the mission. Baghdad really was the beginning of the mission. And having transformed Iraq, the Bush administration's intention was to expand the effort to try to move on to Iran, to Syria, to Egypt, to Saudi Arabia, to Pakistan, so that, consistent with Feith's words, the entire Islamic world would be fundamentally changed. Well, what has this effort produced thus far? Well, it's produced one failure after another. 7 years into the global war on terror, 5.5 years after the invasion of Iraq, we have squandered American power and squandered American strength on an extravagant on an extravagant scale, spending upwards of $1 trillion, expending over 4,000 American lives. And what have we accomplished? Well, what we've accomplished is that we find ourselves stuck with 2 open-ended wars, neither of which suggests that we have cracked the code and understand how to transform Iraq and Afghanistan, much less transform the entire region. Trying harder is not the answer. A new approach to strategy is in order. What might a new strategy look like? Well, we begin by devising that strategy, first of all, by realistically appraising the threat that we face, the threat posed by violent Islamic radicalism. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, President Bush and other members of his administration compared Osama bin Laden to Adolf Hitler, compared al-Qaeda and violent Islamic radicalism to a threat that was equal in its danger to Nazi Germany. These turned out to be vastly overstated. Violent Islamic radicalism does pose a threat to the United States. but that threat falls far short of being an existential threat. What we need to do, in lieu of waging an open-ended global war in order to try to deal with the problem of violent Islamic radicalism, is come to see the threat for what it is. The terrorists, Al-Qaeda, similar networks, really constitute an international criminal conspiracy. And the way to deal with an international criminal conspiracy is not by invading and occupying and attempting to transform whole nations. The way to deal with an international criminal conspiracy is through police means. Well, the essence of our new strategy ought to be the United States leading an international effort, sustained, ruthless, to root out the terror networks and to kill the terrorists. This won't be easy. It won't happen overnight, but it can certainly be accomplished much more effectively and much more affordably than the kind of policies that we've seen for the past 7 years. A serious presidential election would be one in which at least one of the candidates was able to recognize the defects of the Bush strategy and was able to offer some sort of a distinctive alternative. The disappointment in the current presidential campaign as it's shaping up is we have two candidates who in essence agree on framing U.S. policy as part of a global war on terror. Senator McCain and Senator Obama disagree on operational priorities, one of them emphasizing Iraq, the other emphasizing Afghanistan. Both of them, however, are committed to the fundamental strategy of global war that President Bush has instituted. That means almost certainly the outcome of this election will be a disappointment. In many respects, it suggests that the real winner in this election will be President Bush himself, as his defective strategy carries on into the next presidential administration.